So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this lecture. So the program today is that I'm going to begin by summarizing our last lecture, and then we'll have an opportunity to consider any questions that you might have arising from that lecture or from the seminar last Friday. So if you do have any comments or any questions, please do post them on the chat. And then we will continue with our discussion of governance, and then we'll move on to internal administration and external stakeholders. So that's the program for today. So in the fourth lecture, we looked at membership of international financial institutions. So we noted that the materials that have been shared with you deal with, will provide an overview of this subject. We wanted to look at one particular aspect in a bit more detail, which was the issue of withdrawal by a member from an international financial institution. We noted that withdrawal is unusual, so much so that IFI membership has a certain permanence to it. This permanence helped explain why the financial statements of IFIs presented members' interests as equity and not as debt, even though such interests are not negotiable, i.e. they cannot be transferred to a third party, and that upon withdrawal of a member, the IFI is required to repurchase these shares. Another issue that withdrawal presents is whether the amount of payment by the IFI to the withdrawing member for its shares should include a proportionate share of the accumulated profits reflected in the reserves. There is no uniformity of treatment among IFIs. At the EBRD, for instance, the most the withdrawing member may receive is the amount paid in upon purchase of the shares. By contrast, at AIIB, the withdrawing member receives the book value of the shares at the time of withdrawal. In the fourth lecture, we looked in some detail at membership in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The AIIB is an interesting example of an IFI to examine because it is the most recent of the major IFIs and, in a sense, the most modern. Moreover, uniquely, it has hallmarks of both regional and global IFIs. It has a regional focus, but it may finance projects outside of the region, exceptionally even in non-members, and its membership is global, 103 approved members and counting, but as we noted, not including the United States, Japan, and Mexico, 3 of the G20 states. All of the other G20 states are members. Several features regarding the AIIB were highlighted in the lecture. First, unlike at many other IFIs, eligibility for membership at the AIIB is not confined to states. This conveniently avoids having to address the sometimes difficult question of whether an applicant qualifies as a country. Rather, at AIIB, membership is open only to members of IBRD and ADB. This helps explain why Hong Kong, which is not a state, is nonetheless a member of AIIB. Although not mentioned at the lecture, we should note that there is a special provision under the Articles of the AIIB which provides that, in the case of an applicant which is not sovereign, its application must be supported by the member that is responsible for its international relations. So Hong Kong's application was supported by the People's Republic of China. Secondly, like other IFIs, AIIB provides for regional and non-regional members. The AIIB region, as we saw, is defined as Asia and Oceania, as classified by the UN Statistical Division, unless the Articles or the Board of Governors decide otherwise. We noted that the Articles provide that the whole of the Russian Federation is in the region, even though the United Nations categorizes the entire country as part of Eastern Europe. Thirdly, The distinction between regional and non-regional membership is important at AIIB, but plays out somewhat differently from that at other institutions. For instance, uniquely, the AIIB is able to invest in projects in non-regional members, provided that there is a significant benefit for the region. We saw that an example of such a benefit is where the project in the non-regional member generates a public good, like mitigating the effects of climate change, and which, by definition, benefits all members. Fourthly, as with other IFIs, the AIIB is confined to investing in its members. However, in exceptional circumstances, and following an especially demanding approval process, the AIIB may invest in non-members. In our lecture, we noted that other IFIs also sometimes invest outside of their member countries by utilizing donor resources rather than their own, as we saw at EBRD in relation to Kosovo, or by allocating surplus income, as we saw at the IBRD in relation to Palestine. Fifthly and finally, at AIIB, the sheer number of members, 103 approved members to date, and the ability of the institution to invest in non-regional members and exceptionally in non-members makes the institution stand apart. So after considering membership at IFIs at our last lecture, we then turn to consider the governance of IFIs. As stated in the lecture, governance at international financial institutions is about the allocation and exercise of power in decision-making, the manner in which decisions are informed, and how the institution is held to account for the decisions it makes. Good governance implies that power is distributed rationally and fairly, and that it is exercised responsibly, that decisions are transparently and soundly made, and that the institution is accountable not only to its members, but to those affected by its actions. In the lecture, we noted too that good governance is demanded by the rule of law. This is a notion as relevant to international organizations generally, and IFIs in particular, as it is to states. Here, reference was made to the page on the AIIB website entitled The Role of Law at the AIIB, and the link has been shared with you. We observed that one common way in which IFIs address how the question of how power should be allocated and exercised is by having rules regarding both the participation of members in decision-making, that is voting, and high-level appointments. With regard to voting, we had spoken already about how at international organizations generally, the principle prevails of one member, one vote, whereas in IFIs, the prevailing principle is that voting power is largely a function of economic power. We noted too that, additionally, a certain number of votes are allocated equally across all members in order to ensure some minimum voice for all members, irrespective of their level of economic power. We noted too that rules sometimes regulate high-level appointments, for example, requiring that the executive head be a national of a member state or of a country in the region of focus of the IFI. There are frequently established processes for making senior appointments, for example, through the election by the Board of Governors or appointment by the Board of Directors. The outcome of those processes is influenced by the allocation of voting power among members, given that those members are represented at the Boards of Governors and Directors. We noted that often rules about high-level appointments are not stated in the charters of the IFIs, but are reflected in the practice of the institution. For example, the heads of the IMF, World Bank, and ADB have traditionally been European, American, and Japanese, respectively. This arrangement suits many states, but is criticized by others. At senior levels, immediately below the executive head, positions are sometimes filled having regard to geographical representation. This is the case often with vice presidents, and to a lesser extent, other members of the executive committees of international financial institutions. Sometimes this is expressly permitted in the charters of the IFIs, provided that the paramount consideration is given to technical competence. Towards the end of the lecture, we turned to consider AIIB's governance, and this is where we pick up again in the 5th lecture today. So let me pause there and invite people to record in the chat function if they have any comments that they would wish to make, or if they have any questions that they would like to raise in relation to that summary I've just made, or the lecture generally, or even the seminar on Friday. So while you're reflecting on that and perhaps writing your comments, let me continue with our discussion about governance at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. In seeking to understand governance at IFIs generally, it is good to take the AIIB as an example to study specifically. This is because the AIIB is the newest of the large IFIs, and so many of the features of governance found in the other IFIs are now firmly established in the practice of IFIs. Being the newest of the international financial institutions family has also enabled the AIIB to adopt innovative features of governance, unburdened by its own history. Indeed, the story of AIIB governance, as reflected either in its charter or the decisions of its governance bodies, can be understood as one of continuity and change, heritage and innovation. So let us look first at those elements of the AIIB's charter that represent continuity. So what are the elements in the charter that are part of a continuum of governance or good governance at international financial institutions generally? Here we can note that the AIIB charter is modeled on that of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which in turn was modeled on that of the Asian Development Bank. So at the AIIB, we have a number of lawyers who come from the EBRD, and for them it's very easy to find their way around the charter. We also have some lawyers who come from the Asian Development Bank, so the AIIB charter is also fairly familiar to them in terms of both the structure of the provisions and the content of many of the provisions. So elements of this commonality include the existence of the familiar governance bodies, the Board of Governors, the Board of Directors, and the President. So all international financial institutions have those three governance bodies. Again, the Board of Governors, the Board of Directors, and the President. Sometimes the names are a little bit different, but these are the most common names. Other elements of commonality include the membership and shareholding structure, including the notion in most IFIs of callable capital. And these elements of commonality also extend to various powers of the institution and various constraints. So in all of these matters, there is a high degree of uniformity, even though, of course, there are some differences in detail. Another element of continuity reflected in the basic documents of the AIIB is the adoption by the chief negotiators of the treaty of a report setting out certain understandings which were recorded as an aid to applying the charter. This is an innovation established by EBRD and adopted by AIIB. Much of what is stated in these reports are matters for the record, which may be useful for the institution and its members when adopting certain policies or considering future amendments. For example, the AIIB's Chief Negotiators Report states that if more than 30% of the shares of the institution were ever to be held by non-regional members, then, in the view of the chief negotiators, the AIIB would lose its regional character. So, just recapping on this, at the EBRD, when the charter was put together very quickly, unlike the charter of the IBRD, the EBRD one was put together in about 1/10 of the time. But there were certain points that couldn't really be agreed upon by all of those who were negotiating the charter. They felt that there was support for a number of initiatives or views, but they weren't really appropriate for including in the charter. So they agreed that they would record these particular elements for the benefit of those who were applying the charter, and including for the benefit of those who would be interpreting the charter in the future. So that was the first time that that had been done, and it was decided when the AIIB was established that this would also be a useful innovation for AIIB to apply also. So as I said, the reports of the chief negotiators at both the EBRD and the AIIB are relevant for applying the charter, but they're also relevant to the interpretation of the respective charters. So we have already seen that the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties applies to the charters of the institutions, while international organizations are not party to the Vienna Convention. The provisions that relate to the interpretation of the treaty are essentially reflective of customary international law and therefore binding on those organizations. So you'll recall when we discussed the Vienna Convention that that is a convention that has provisions which codify customary international law and has other provisions which reflect the progressive development of international law. So the Vienna Convention, being a treaty, is not itself binding on the international financial institutions, but those provisions, which can be viewed as reflective of customary international law, are relevant to the international financial institutions, and indeed those rules of customary international law codified in the convention are directly applicable to the international financial institutions. And if you look at the Vienna Convention, the rules that relate to treaty interpretation are on the whole reflective of customary international law rules. So the Vienna Convention provisions dealing with interpretation of treaties are applicable indirectly to the international financial institutions because they reflect customary international law. And in terms of content, the basic rule under the Vienna Convention, and as reflected in customary international law, is that conventions, such as the IFI charters, must be interpreted in good faith in accordance with the ordinary meaning to be given to the terms of the treaty in their context and in the light of its object and purpose. So again, conventions must be interpreted in good faith in accordance with the ordinary meaning to be given to the terms of the treaty in their context and in light of their object and purpose. And a good faith interpretation implies that reference will be made to the reports of the chief negotiators where relevant. So we have observed how many of the governance features of the AIIB are common to other IFIs, and this results in the AIIB being situated naturally in the family of international financial institutions. However, the AIIB Charter also reflects a number of innovations. So what then are some of the points of departure, the changes, the innovations, as reflected in the Charter of the AIIB? Here, several aspects may be highlighted. So the AIIB, as we noted in an earlier lecture, is majority owned and controlled by regional members. This is unique among the major international financial institutions. At the other institutions, as we observed, the majority of the shares and the control of the institution resides with those states on the whole. There are some international institutions, but states on the whole that are not expected to be borrowers of the institution. So this has important implications for governance, because at the AIIB, it is the countries that are expected to borrow, or at least eligible to borrow from the institution, which together have majority ownership and control of the institution. So there is a special responsibility on them to adopt and apply high standards when they are approving policies and strategies, and when they are supervising the management of the institution undertaken by the president. Another difference to the AIIB is that there is a voice for all members, irrespective of their economic power. Now, this is not unique to AIIB, but this is not common to all institutions. So at AIIB, there's a relatively large number of shares. 12% of the shares are spread evenly across all the members, so that the largest shareholder and so that the largest economic power and the smallest economic power have the same number of these basic shares. A further innovation of the AIIB is that it has a non-resident board of directors. So almost all of the major international financial institutions have a resident board of directors. The exception is IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And the AIIB follows IFAD in this respect in having a non-resident board. And we'll come back to this in a moment, but you may want to give some thought as I speak to what you might think are the benefits of having a non-resident board over having a resident board. At the AIIB, there's also an ability of directors to split their vote according to instructions from their respective members. This is an arrangement which exists also at the EBRD, but it is different from the arrangement which exists at the IBRD. So the IBRD, a director will represent usually a very large number of countries at the IBRD. And when a director speaks, he or she speaks on behalf of the members generally, or more accurately, perhaps, when the director comes to vote on a proposal, there is one vote. There is one possibility of extending support or withholding support. There is no possibility to split the votes. So this can present a challenge for directors at the IBRD when there are differing views in a constituency. At the EBRD and also the AIIB, a director is able to split the vote. So at a board meeting, it's not unusual when views on a policy proposal, for example, are being solicited. A director would say, something like my constituencies all support this particular proposal. However, country X has its misgivings, and accordingly, I would like to record that that in my constituency, all of the countries other than country X support the proposal, and country X would like to abstain or would like to record its objection. Perfectly common at the AIIB and EBRD, very impossible at the IBRD. Another innovation at the AIIB is that there is the possibility for the institution to make amendments to its charter in a way that is predictable and that is streamlined. So at the other institutions generally, if there is a proposal to change any element of the charter, then there is quite a labyrinth process that needs to be gone through in order for that to be effected. So typically, the highest governance body would have to endorse the proposal, and then it would go back to the members, and they would have to go through their constitutional processes to lend support to the change. Now, this is so cumbersome that in some of the large international financial institutions, there has never been an amendment because it's just so cumbersome. And one of the consequences is that in circumstances where an amendment perhaps would have been warranted, but is impossible to obtain, then there have been interpretations adopted either by the governance bodies or put forward by the General Council, which go to the edge of interpretation, and where in other circumstances an amendment would have been viewed as being a cleaner route. At the EBRD, the first time that the charter was amended, it was to accommodate the inclusion of a country, namely Mongolia, as a recipient member of the EBRD in circumstances where all of the Board of Directors and the Board of Governors were supportive of the proposal. But the charter required unanimity for such a change, and that meant that every member had to actively approve the proposal in order for the amendment to come into effect. So an abstention, as it were, or inaction, would effectively count as a no vote and would therefore scupper the proposal. So in the end, the amendment was approved, but it took 4 years before the approval was amended. So that just underscores how difficult an amendment can sometimes be to achieve. Now there it was complicated by the fact that unanimity was needed, but unanimity is needed in a number of important instances. And so whenever unanimity is needed at many of the international financial institutions, it can be expected that this would require a number of years before the amendment would come into effect. Now at the AIIB, there is a provision in the Charter that enables the Board of Governors alone to approve amendments. So the members, when they went to their respective parliaments the first time to get approval for the AIIB Charter, they would have presented to their respective parliaments, if indeed it's a parliamentary system that pertains, the reality that the Charter that was being approved included a provision that future amendments would not involve having to go back to that Parliament. So this is an innovation that exists also at IFA, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and it exists now at the AIIB as well. Now, of course, this is not something that can be done lightly, and therefore the voting thresholds are quite high. And in some instances, unanimity is required. So that's a tall order, but if all of the governors support a particular amendment, then they can approve it and the amendment can take effect. No need to go back to the members. A further innovation that's reflected in the charter of the AIB is that the board of directors has the ability to delegate to the president the power to approve financing for projects. So at the major international financial institutions, the rule is that the board of directors approves projects. In the case of, say, the World Bank, the board of directors is meeting frequently, quite regularly. It meets twice a week. And of course, there is other business to attend to as well, but the approval of projects is something that can only be done there by the board of directors. So when the AIB was established, there was some discussion about whether this power to approve projects should reside with the board of directors or with the president. And it was agreed at the negotiations that the power should initially reside with the board of directors, but that the board of directors would be given the authority to delegate this power to the president. And when you think about this, you can recall also that there is this provision whereby at the AIB, the board of directors is a non-resident board. So it seems to me there is some linkage that if you have a resident board, if it can be in session whenever is needed, then it's easier for that board to consider and approve projects. When you have a non-resident board, then it's a little bit more difficult. Of course, board meetings of the board of directors can be convened fairly easily and can be done by Zoom as we are doing now. But there is a certain distance between the approvals being made and the specificities of the project. So there is some distance, which means that delegating that power to the president in international financial institutions that have non-resident boards seems to me to be an easier thing to achieve and to support than would be the case where there is a resident board almost constantly sitting. So that's a further example of an innovation reflected in the AIB Charter. The AIB Charter also has a provision which I think is unique to IFI charters, which calls on the board of directors to adopt an oversight mechanism. So there is a provision in the AIB Charter where the president is expected to manage the institution under the supervision of the board of directors, and the board of directors is expected to adopt some kind of mechanism to oversee various actions. This provision doesn't exist in the other institutions, but there is a practice in most of the other institutions of having some form of oversight mechanism, but at the AIB, this is formalized. And the final innovation that is reflected in the charter of the AIB that I wanted to mention is that it calls upon the president of the institution to be elected by an open, transparent, and merit-based process. So that's a provision that doesn't exist at any of the other international financial institutions. So all of those innovations that I mentioned, innovations that are reflected in the charter of the AIIB, but some innovations also emanate from some of the decisions that are made by the AIIB. And these decisions are typically decisions of the Board of Directors, but in some instances also by the Board of Governors. So the Board of Directors have indeed adopted an accountability framework. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, there are accountability frameworks that have been established at other institutions, but the AIIB calls in its charter for the adoption of such a framework. And the Board of Directors has acted on that obligation and has adopted an accountability framework that more clearly demarcates the responsibilities of the board and the president. So the board now sets the strategies and the policies, and it holds the president to account for implementing the strategies and policies. And meanwhile, the president manages the bank, including approving projects via this delegated authority. So the modalities of the accountability framework of the AIIB provide for a progressive delegation of approval authority for projects. So eventually the president is expected to approve all or almost all projects, but for now they are progressively being delegated to the president. So under the specific arrangements that have been adopted at the AIIB, usually when a project represents the first project in a country, or the first project in a sector, or the first project using a particular investment instrument, then the matter will go to the board for their approval. But eventually the AIIB will run out of firsts. The board also looks at those projects that meet a particular risk profile or which in some other respect is unusual. Another interesting feature of that delegation is that even though the board of directors has agreed the basis upon which they delegate to the president, if any one director feels that a project proposal involves some issue that that director feels ought to be considered by the board, then the matter can move from the presidency's competence to that of the board. And equally, if there are instances where the president has a power to approve projects, but he or she feels that what is being proposed is of a nature that the board really should have a view on this, then the president is able to have that matter referred back to the board. In addition to the accountability framework, the board of directors has also adopted an oversight mechanism. So again, the oversight mechanism is called for by the charter, and the board of directors has acted on this. So they have adopted an oversight mechanism to ensure that the bank is accountable for certain decisions. So one aspect of which is the establishment of a dedicated unit, the AIIB, that reports directly to the board of directors. And this handles complaints from third parties in relation to misprocurement and complaints regarding the bank's alleged failure not to follow its environmental, social, and certain other policies. And finally, in relation to examples of AIIB decisions that reflect governance innovations, the Board of Governors has approved rules for the election of the president. So the charter uniquely calls for the election to take place based on an open, transparent, and merit-based premise that doesn't exist anywhere else. And the AIB's Board of Governors has adopted rules for the election of the president, and these have been drafted in such a way that they should apply to all future elections, and they were applied most recently for the re-election of the current incumbent. So that's one thing I think for you to think about, and maybe this is something we'll talk about in a seminar about the whole basis for the appointment or election of senior officials. How ought that to be done? What does good governance demand? So that's the end of what I wanted to say about governance and governance at the AIB in particular. Are there any comments or questions? Maybe I'll just pause for a few minutes and let people reflect on what I've said in relation to governance and governance of the AIB in particular. And if you do have comments, please do jot them down in the chat. So has asked if I could expand on the appointment process of senior officials at the other institutions. So I will talk a little bit about the Board of Governors and Board of Directors, but let me say a word about the President. So at the IBRD, the President is appointed by the Board of Directors, not the Board of Governors, but by the Board of Directors. And my understanding of how that process works in practice is that by the time the Board of Directors is formally asked to make an appointment, there is informal agreement on who the candidate should be. And as I said, the tradition is that the person is always an American, and that's a tradition that dates back to the first days of the IBRD and is an unbroken tradition. In the same way as at the IMF, it's always a European, and at the Asian Development Bank, it is always a Japanese national. So that is not provided for in the rules, but that is the practice. Australia is always very vocal in complaining about the system, because of course it's not, Australian nationals are not European, and they're not American, and they're not Japanese. So that implies that even though Australia is a member of the G20, has some economic power and influence, it is unlikely to ever be able to have a national that is the head of one of those institutions. Although I should say that Jim Wolfenson, who was a president of the IBRD, had joint Australian and US citizenship. So that process at the IBRD then, it is different from the AIB, because first of all, it's the Board of Directors that makes the appointment rather than the Board of Governors. And secondly, the process is not provided for in the Charter, and the process appears to be highly informal, where there are a lot of soundings that take place behind closed doors until a point is reached at which it is felt that there is sufficient support for a particular candidate, who again is always of the one nationality. And I think at the AIB, the idea was that this should be, the process should be different. The AIB Charter does say that the president should be a national of a country in the region. So there is a constraint there, but otherwise the person should be selected on a meritorious basis. And the rules of election for the president at the AIB address each of those elements. So the rules are transparent, because you can find, because first of all, there are rules, they exist. It's not just an informal practice. And secondly, those rules are published, so you can find them on the AIB website. And there is an open process, so governors are invited to nominate candidates, and there is a reasonable time period in which they can do that. And the governors also have an opportunity for asking questions of the candidates. And there is a list of credentials that are viewed as being ideal for a candidate that are all set out in those rules. So the rules for the election of the AIB president state the attributes of the ideal candidate. So it's always possible that a candidate could have different attributes, but the ideal attributes are set out. The Board of Governors, of course, cannot state that candidates must have certain attributes, because as soon as they do that, they would be taking away from themselves the ability to appoint whoever they think is the most appropriate candidate at the moment of the election. So an example of that is that the ideal candidate in the election rules includes someone who has extensive knowledge in the area of development, including in Asia. But you might have a candidate whose development experience is in other parts of the developing world, but in all other respects is an ideal candidate. Or you may have a candidate who in fact doesn't really have very strong development experience, but has a very strong track record of achievement in other areas, and the governors feel that this is the kind of candidate they need to steer the institution through a particular phase. So the merit-based, open and transparent process of the AIB is reflected in the rules. At the other institutions, they are not reflected in the rules, and the selection of candidates happens in a much more informal manner. At the EBRD, the voting power really resides with the European countries. And so if there is consensus among the European finance ministers on a candidate, then that candidate will usually be supported by the Board of Governors. However, there are some instances where the finance ministers have not been able to settle on a candidate, and that happened 2 elections ago, as a result of which election rules for that particular election only were developed, and there was a truly competitive process and an open and fairly transparent process. But as a rule, the elections seem to be done in a sort of more opaque way. Thank you for that question. So let me now turn to internal administration. So we can begin by talking about the relevance of the 3 governance bodies. So in our consideration of the governance of IFIs, we have talked about the role of governance bodies, typically the Board of Governors, the Board of Directors, and the President. And the President, incidentally, is sometimes also loosely referred to as the management. And in doing that, it's basically the executive team of the President, including the President, that's captured within that governance body. But strictly speaking, the governance body is the President alone. So our discussion so far has involved references to these formal bodies, the governors, directors, and president, and how they work, with our focus being on structures and rules. But the oil that makes the wheels turn, as with any international organization, is the people who carry out the function of these bodies. So in the case of the Board of Governors, the highest in the hierarchy of governance bodies, where all the powers of the institution reside, this body is made up of individuals who are appointed directly by the members, with each member appointing one governor and one alternate governor. Very often in IFIs, the governor is a senior minister in the finance ministry, sometimes the finance minister. The alternate governor is very often another senior politician or a senior member of the civil service. The day-to-day role of a governor in the life of an IFI is, in normal circumstances, very limited. There are few tasks that are reserved to governors. The charters of several IFIs, they authorize the Board of Governors to delegate to the Board of Directors all of their powers other than a limited number of reserve powers. So at the AIB, in the charter, there is a provision that enables the Board of Governors to delegate to the Board of Directors some or all of their powers, with the exception of a limited number of reserve powers. And in the bylaws of the AIB, adopted by the Board of Governors, the Board of Governors has acted on that authority. And so they have delegated to the Board of Directors all of the powers capable of being delegated. And that is also the case, for example, at the EBRD. At EFAD, all of the powers that can be delegated from the highest governance body to the Board of Directors have been delegated, with the exception of the budget. So the budget approval authority at EFAD remains with the Board of Governors, even though the Board of Governors has the ability to delegate it. But certain reserve powers cannot be delegated. And in the case of most institutions, including EBRD, these reserve powers include the likes of admission of new members or the approval of financial statements, although these matters are often performed without a meeting of the governors being called. Usually, the governors meet only once each year at their annual meeting. So the governors and alternate governors play an important role in the institution, but they are quite distanced from its internal administration. And an example of this is that the codes of conduct of the IFIs do not apply to governors and alternate governors. So that was looking at the Board of Governors. Now, in the case of the Board of Directors, the individuals who make up this body are elected by the Board of Governors, and they are entrusted with the stewardship of the organization. An important aspect of this stewardship is providing direction to the president. In IFIs, the board approves strategies and policies and makes certain decisions, including approving investment proposals. Although in the AIIB, as we have seen, this power is being delegated progressively to the president. In some IFIs, the board is resident, which is the case with the IBRD, the IFC, and all the major regional IFIs. In other IFIs, the board of directors is non-resident, which is the case with EFAD and AIIB. Interestingly, when the IMF and the IBRD were being established, of the two principal sponsors, namely the United States and the United Kingdom, it was the UK that had argued for a non-resident board, believing that members would never wish to lose for several years to the new institution highly qualified personnel. The US argument, which ultimately prevailed, was that the institution would be better served by having individuals resident at the place where decisions were deliberated and made, and who could dedicate all their energies to making informed decisions. So this issue continues to arise whenever the creation of a new IFI is under discussion. In the case of the AIB, from the outset of discussions that led to its creation, the assumption was that it would have a non-resident board, the belief being that this was more consistent with modern views of governance. So a question for you is whether you feel that a resident or non-resident board is more appropriate. Put yourselves in a position where someday you were asked to advise on whether a new institution being created should have a resident board or a non-resident board. What would you do? What would your view be? What considerations would you take into account in making your recommendation? So if you look at the record of the discussions that led to the Bretton Woods outcome, it's very interesting about the exchange between the UK and the US. So the UK was adamant that there should be a non-resident board because it feared that the quality of the officials would not be as high otherwise, and it could not envisage losing, for its immediate benefit, some of its best people in order to ship them across the Atlantic Ocean for several years to work at the new institution. And the fear of the US was that if there was a non-resident board, then there would not be enough focus given to decision making, and the decision makers would be too distanced, both literally and figuratively, from the decisions that had to be made. So the Americans prevailed in the end. I think they always had the upper hand, given the economic power that they wielded towards the conclusion of the Second World War. By the time the AIB came into being, then one thing that had changed a great deal was technology, and also the marvels of modern transport. So it's the AIB is expected to meet in accordance with its bylaws 4 times a year as a physical meeting. One of those meetings would occur on the fringes of the annual meeting of the Board of Governors, and the other 3 meetings would take place at the AIB headquarters. So 4 times a year, officials would fly into Beijing. Some directors might be resident in Beijing. For example, the director for China is resident in Beijing. One of the constituencies has a practice of always having its director residing in Beijing. They're not located at the headquarters of the bank, but they reside in Beijing, so it's easy to attend physical meetings, but the others all fly in. And that would not have been foreseeable in 1944 at the time of Bretton Woods. So flights would have been prohibitively expensive for many members, and the flight options and the flexibility that's afforded today, leaving aside the problems of COVID, they were just completely different in 1944 from what they are today. And another change is, of course, it is possible to meet other than physically. So in 1944, even though the IBRD Charter does not provide for it, I suppose it would have been possible to convene a meeting by telephone. Not so easy to conduct if you can't see the other person and you don't have all the same options that we have today. But at the AIIB, even before COVID, it was quite routine to have meetings of the board of directors held over a means such as Zoom. So the meetings typically would only go for a couple of hours. They would usually be convened to consider one or maybe two proposals, not more. But these things could be done. So, and of course, when the AIB was established, all these things were realistic options. So part of the thinking behind the AIB's decision to have a non-resident board was that there's no need to have all of these directors in Beijing because they can fly there when needed and they can participate in the meetings by electronic means when that is called for. And particularly if they are not there to approve projects on a routine basis, then there probably wouldn't be enough work for them in Beijing anyway. So that was the thinking behind the decision in the AIIB. Quite different from the circumstances behind the decision at the IBRD. So unlike the case with governors, directors are subject to the codes of conduct of the international financial institutions. In many instances, these differ in some material respects from the codes applicable to the president and staff. In part, this reflects a recognition that directors have dual loyalties. They must act in the best interests of the organization, which is the case with the director of any corporate body, for example. But in an international organization, they must also follow the instructions that are given to them by the countries which they represent. Directors do not work under the president's control, and they are not subject to any of the directives issued by the president and which bind staff only. Because directors are not staff, they are not subject to the rules often set out in the Charter regarding the qualifications of employees. Nonetheless, the president has some influence over the work of the board of directors, enjoying a power of initiative to recommend the taking by the board of decisions, and also because the president chairs the meetings of the board of directors. So the AIB power structure is a classic one for IFIs, with the president holding enormous authority because he is the legal representative of the institution. He is the chief of staff. He is the chair of the board of directors, and he manages the institution under the supervision of the board. So a great concentration of power. At corporates, modern governance in many parts of the world, not so much in the United States, but certainly in Europe. I don't know about Japan, but modern governance in Europe at least calls for a separation between the roles of the executive head and the head of the supervisory body. So in the very old days, you would have a chairman of a public corporation who was both the executive head and the chair of the board of directors. Now it's more common to have a chief executive officer and a separate chairman of the board. So discussions about governance at the international level across all different kinds of organizations is an ongoing one, and there isn't a single view of what represents the best governance across the world for all organizations. But in the international financial institution world, the prevailing model remains the one that I described, namely with this considerable concentration of power, of day-to-day power in the president, but being supervised by a board of directors which he chairs, and being accountable ultimately to a board of governors that represents all of the members. So that's the board of directors. So again, the individuals who are directors, they are not staff, but they have a closer association with the institution, or day-to-day association, a more intimate association with the institution than that of governors. And one reflection of this is that the directors are bound by a code of conduct. Members of the Board of Governors are not bound by a code of conduct. When I was at IFAD, there was a big discussion about whether representatives at the meetings of the Board of Directors should be subject to any kind of code of conduct. And it was a very controversial issue because the members or the individuals who turned up at those meetings, they were representing their countries. And so unlike at the international financial institutions generally, where you have named individuals as directors, at IFAD, being a UN specialized agency, the directorship was held by countries. So the argument was that if you are there representing a country, then your allegiances erode entirely to that country, and you cannot be subject to a code of conduct of the institution. So there is some merit in that, so much so that you don't have codes of conduct governing these individuals at the UN generally. But at IFAD, there was a compromise reached, and so you have in one of the basic documents of IFAD, you have a code of conduct that provides for certain basic kinds of conduct that are basic kinds of conduct expected to be followed by those who are representing countries at meetings of the Board of Directors of IFAD. So, for example, such a person couldn't just receive any kind of gift without at least disclosing the nature of that gift in circumstances where there might reasonably be a perception that the giving of a gift is connected with how that individual might vote in favor of a particular proposal. So I think that did represent some progress when that code was adopted at IFAD, but that is unique at the UN and the UN specialized agencies to some extent, although of course IBRD and IFC are UN specialized agencies and they do have codes of conduct. So we've talked about the Board of Governors and the Board of Directors. So now turning to the last governance body, the President. So he is an elected official of the International Financial Institution acting under the direction of the Board of Directors. As we noted, in some institutions, he is elected by the Board of Governors, for example, at the AIIB. At other institutions, he is elected by the Board of Directors, for example, at the IBRD. He or she is not staff. He or she is an elected official, although the President is expected to meet the standards of staff. For example, directives issued by the President to staff are generally considered as applying also to the President. So if those directives set standards that the staff are expected to follow, then the president is expected to follow the same high level of standards. In most of the major IFIs, including the AIIB, the president is subject to the same code of conduct as applies to staff. Now, with regard to vice presidents, practice varies somewhat across international financial institutions. So at the IBRD, there are many, many vice presidents, I think 25 or 30 of them, and they are appointed by the president. At the EBRD and at the AIIB, vice presidents are appointed by the board of directors, but on the recommendation of the president. Generally speaking, vice presidents are subject to the same code of conduct as applies to staff. However, at some institutions, for example, the EBRD, vice presidents are not classified as staff, and therefore they are not subject to all the same rules as applied to staff, for example, in relation to hiring and firing. So that's the situation with regard to vice presidents. But of course, the great bulk of an IFI's internal administration is undertaken by its staff. Now, their legal status, like that of employees of all international organizations, is that of international civil servants. So the staff of international financial institutions are international civil servants. And there is some history to how this arose, which is interesting, but I think the high water mark came with the establishment of the predecessor to the United Nations. So in the 1920s and 1930s, the predecessor organization, the League of Nations, it needed staff for its secretariat. And there was a debate about how those staff should be sourced, and there was considerable support for the view that these individuals should be seconded by the state members. And then there would be a question about to whom their loyalty would be owed, a dilemma, incidentally, which exists in relation to directors today, where there's a recognition that there are dual loyalties, one to the institution and one to the members appointing them. But at the League, the view that ultimately prevailed was that the institution should hire its own staff. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be secondees, but the rule was that the institution would hire its own staff. So rather than having civil servants seconded by member states, there would be international civil servants recruited directly by the League. And so that's really the precedent that continues to be followed today. And staff being international civil servants is something that is usually reflected in the basic documents of the institution, and that's certainly the case with regard to the AIIB. And this is not only the charter, but it's also the applicable code of conduct that will address this. So there are a number of important implications that arise from staff being international civil servants. So first, the hiring and dismissal of IFI staff, the setting of their work conditions, and the evaluation of their performance, as well as the rules around their compensation and promotion, are not reflective of the laws of the host state or indeed any national law. Rather, the IFI self-regulates these matters although of course the content of the rules may be informed by what happens at the national level. With regard to hiring specifically, IFIs are usually compelled to recruit on an open and transparent basis with primary regard to the merit of the candidates. However, most IFIs allow the nationality of the candidates to be taken into account to some extent in order to achieve a more diverse workforce reflective of the membership. Once they are recruited, IFI staff are bound by the terms of their letter of appointment, the internal law of the institution, which is usually set out in the Code of Conduct and staff directives and guidance, and general principles of administrative law. So again, staff are bound by their letter of appointment, the internal law of the institution, and general principles of international administrative law. Those general principles are largely derived from the jurisprudence of the leading administrative tribunals of international organizations, such as the United Nations Administrative Tribunal and the International Labour Organization Administrative Tribunal, but also the tribunals of the World Bank and several regional development banks. So a second implication of staff being international civil servants is that they owe their duty entirely to the institution and not to any national authority. Similarly, members of the institution are prohibited from improperly influencing staff in their work. This helps ensure the independence of the international civil service. A third implication of staff being international civil servants is that their complaints must be addressed outside the operation of domestic tribunals and processes. So most organizations have in place rules that seek to mediate disputes, which, if still unresolved, may be determined by the president having regard to a recommendation of an independent expert panel. In turn, the lawfulness of the president's decision may be tested before an administrative tribunal rather than a domestic court, although there are cases of European courts being prepared to take jurisdiction if that process is insufficient to protect any rights under the European Convention on Human Rights. So maybe just to expand on that a little bit. So if you are a member of staff at an international financial institution and you have some complaint about your contract not being respected, then in the ordinary course, you cannot go to a domestic court because the domestic court will not have jurisdiction. And as you'll recall, when we discussed privileges and immunities, there is not only jurisdictional immunity for the institution, but there is a broader range of immunities. So those immunities will normally hold, provided that the institution provides some credible means for resolving disputes. So in the ordinary course, as with any institution, there's usually some effort made by the Human Resources Department to try and resolve the complaint. The complaint might relate to a grievance by a staff member that they should have been eligible for promotion, or they should have been considered for a title change, or they feel that they're entitled to some benefit that is not being paid. So whatever their complaint is, the Human Resources Department will try and resolve it. And in some institutions, including AIB, then mediation can play a key role here. Now, if the dispute cannot be resolved that way, then the staff member may ask the president of the institution to resolve that. So there are processes in place to achieve this, and typically what happens is that there will be an appointment of an external third party, usually a lawyer, but not always, or there might be a body of several people, including a mix of internal and external people, but usually with an external chair. And that person or that body will consider all the issues and speak to all the individuals and look at all the documents and come up with a recommendation to the president. And the president will take all this into consideration and will make a decision. At the AIIB, that process exists. If there's a request for the president to review a complaint, then the president appoints an external person from a list that's maintained by the Office of the General Counsel. That person isn't necessarily a lawyer, depending on the nature of the complaint. It could be an actuary. The person is complaining about the calculation of their retirement plan benefits, or it could be an accountant, or it could be some other professional. And then that person speaks with everybody, gives everyone an opportunity to have their say, and looks at all the evidence and evaluates it, applies the applicable law, which is international administrative law, or more accurately, it's a combination of the letter of appointment, the internal law of the institution, and the general principles of international administrative law. And then the recommendation goes to the president, and a copy of the recommendation goes to the staff member. If the president then can make whatever decision he likes, but if he makes a decision that is different from that which is recommended, then he must provide reasons for that decision. At other institutions, such as at the EBRD, there is a body that is chaired by an external lawyer and has two individuals who are representative of staff, one appointed by the president and the other one appointed by the staff council. And that body more or less does the same work as at the AIIB, and their work results in a recommendation to the president. If there is then concern about, on the part of the staff member with the grievance, that the president in making his or her decision has breached a legal obligation, then there is, in most institutions, a possibility of having this resolved before a tribunal. The tribunals are sometimes hosted by the institutions, particularly the larger institutions. So the World Bank has an administrative tribunal, the EBRD has an administrative tribunal. In the case of some other institutions, including sometimes some large institutions, they don't have their own tribunal, but they use other tribunals. And the best known ones are the United Nations Administrative Tribunal, where not only does the UN go, but also some specialized agencies can go, such as IFAD now goes to the United Nations Administrative Tribunal, or complaints could go to the ILOAT, the International Labour Organization Administrative Tribunal. And the International Labour Organization Administrative Tribunal has a long pedigree, and that was established at the time of the League of Nations. And the decisions of those administrative tribunals are final. Now, in the case of the AIIB is still new. There is a commitment reflected in the staff regulations approved by the Board of Directors to have an administrative tribunal. The current state is that the Board of Directors has said that they would like some experience to be generated by this lower level grievance body. And there's an expectation too that some staff representative body would also have a hand in designing an eventual administrative tribunal. One, therefore, will be established at some point when the institution is a bit more mature. But in the meantime, if there is a complaint, it would be dealt with on the basis of an ad hoc arrangement, for example, having an independent arbitrator issue a binding decision. So the one consequence of staff at international financial institutions being international civil servants is that their grievances must be resolved internally and not at the level of domestic courts. There are some cases in Europe where I think the French and the Belgian courts have indicated that they would be prepared to take jurisdiction if they feel that there is no credible grievance system open to their nationals. And they are ready to do that because those courts need to hold the state parties to the European Convention on Human Rights accountable for their commitments. And one of those commitments is Article 6 of the European Convention, which provides that everyone should have a free, well, it actually provides that everyone should have a free, fair trial, but that's been understood as meaning that a proper process should be afforded to everyone who has a complaint about their legal rights not being respected. So there should be a process and there should be a remedy. And also, those courts hold that the immunities of the organization, they will hold, provided that the organizations themselves can provide some credible alternative to domestic courts for having the legal rights of the staff members who are also nationals of those countries where the courts are located being respected. So one question for you to think about is, what are the merits and demerits of IFI staff being international civil servants? I mean, would it have been better, in fact, if the tradition established when the League was created was that members would second staff from their own respective civil service? Now, in the case of international financial institutions, particularly those that are investing in the private sector, probably domestic civil services will not have the requisite expertise internally to enable them to second appropriate staff. So maybe it would not work so well for some kinds of staff, for some kinds of areas of expertise needed by the IFIs. Nonetheless, one could imagine a mix of individuals being seconded by the institution, but then the question would arise of to whom are the loyalties owed, and also international civil servants recruited directly by the institution. So one could envisage a mix of the two, but in your view, what would be best? And when thinking about that and the role of staff as international civil servants, do you think that domestic labour tribunals should ever have a say in resolving IFI disputes that they have with their employer? So if you think of yourself, if you were to go and work for an international financial institution somewhere, you might find that the rules are more generous than what would be offered in your home state in some respects, but less generous in others. So you might find that the amount of maternity leave to which you are entitled is much less than what you would be entitled to if you were working for the government in your home country, or even if you were working anywhere else, because of the nature of the domestic law. So you might find in that respect that you're worse off if you work for the international financial institution. But on the other hand, you might find that your level of sick pay is much more generous, or your number of holidays is much more generous. So what then ought the relevance to be of the rules that would be applicable in the home state? Now, of course, it's not possible for an international financial institution to be able to respect the rules of every member because there are so many members and those rules won't always be consistent. They'll often be contradictory. And also they may not necessarily be in the best interest of the institution. But nonetheless, knowing what the content of those rules are, the content of, say, domestic rules on sick leave or on maternity leave, paid maternity leave, knowing what those are can be relevant for informing the content of the rules of the international financial institutions. Similarly, in relation to process. So if you are used to a particular kind of process with a certain level of transparency and so forth, perhaps it will be less at an international financial institution. On the other hand, you may come from a jurisdiction where there's very little transparency, where the rules really don't meet international standards. And then at the international financial institution, you would find the processes around grievances as being much more in your favor. So something for you to think about, so beyond a comparison of how this might benefit or not benefit you, or benefit one personally, is there anything else that can be learned for the benefit of the institution from looking at what happens at the domestic level, at the member states? So that's all I wanted to say in relation to our subject of internal administration. So let me just pause there for a moment and ask you to reflect on what we've talked about and to see if there is anything else that you would like to talk about here, or if you have any comments, or if you have any questions. So while you're thinking about those issues and noting your comments in the chat box, let me make a start on the next subject, just to introduce it. And here we're going to talk about the external stakeholders. So we use the term stakeholders very broadly, very loosely. So we've looked at the relationship of the IFI to those who are internal to the institution, to the board of governors, the board of directors, the president. So we looked at the governance bodies, and we've also looked at the staff as international civil servants. So these are all internal stakeholders, as it were. But there are various categories of external stakeholders. For example, there are categories of personnel other than staff. For example, consultants working full-time for the institution. There are other consultancy contracts. For example, when the institution is working on a project proposal, it may hire lawyers to advise the institution on that particular project. Very common for the AIIB or EBRD or IFC when working on a private sector project to hire lawyers to advise on the taking of local law security, because that kind of expertise does not reside within the institution. And even if it does, it's probably more efficient to outsource it. So a law firm would be hired to provide that kind of consultancy work. The third category of external stakeholders would be counterparties to IFI procurement contracts. For example, the procurement of goods and services. Another example would be counterparties to the purchase and lease agreements for office space, the headquarters building, resident offices. A further category of external stakeholders would be counterparties to IFI treasury activity and operational investment activity. So in relation to treasury, who are the treasury counterparts? In relation to operational investment activity, who are the borrowers? Who are the equity investees? Who are the beneficiaries of guarantees? These are all external stakeholders. And what connects all of those categories is that the relationship between the international financial institution and all of those categories of personnel, other than staff, or the consultants, or the various counterparties I've listed, the relationship is a contractual one. But external stakeholders can also include third parties who are affected by IFI's operational investment activity, but where there is no contract. Perhaps a contract can be implied, but on the whole, there is no contractual arrangement. And here you can think of those who might have complaints. For example, a party that is affected adversely by a project being financed by an international financial institution. And here you can consider again the JAMS case involving the IFC, where you had some parties in India who claimed that they were adversely affected by a project that was being financed by IFC. And the final category I wanted to note of external stakeholders are the regulators. So regulators can be setting rules, for instance, for certain persons to follow, and they can also be setting rules that can inform the rules that are adopted by international financial institutions. But here again, the relationship between the regulator and the IFI, for reasons we will discover a bit later on, is not contractual. But in many instances, the relationship is contractual. And where the relationship involving the IFI is contractual, then all the usual considerations relevant to contracts generally will apply. So for example, when an IFI procures furniture for its headquarters or hires a law firm to advise on a transaction, the contract will address the nature of the goods or services to be supplied and the terms of payment and so forth. However, contracts with IFIs will also need to take into account the special status, exemptions, privileges and immunities of international organizations that we've already discussed. So in the two examples just given, the contracts would need to ensure, for instance, that VAT or goods and services tax are not included in the price, as the IFI is exempted by its members from paying these. Now, two related issues that frequently arise in the context of contracts with IFIs include the law that governs them and the means of resolving disputes. And at our next class, we will look at the governing law in relation to contracts between the international financial institution and third-party stakeholders. And we will look at the related issue too of how disputes between those parties can be resolved. But at this point, I would stop and I would ask if you could reflect on those issues, and then we will take them forward next week. So I see we do have one question here from, so I think the question here is, has there been a case where an IFI that usually tends not to submit to domestic laws and instead resolves issues internally has been brought before a domestic court. So yes, the examples that I gave of the domestic courts, I think it was the cases were brought against NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the individuals brought cases before, I think, the French and the Belgian courts. There's if you want to Google this, you can find, I think the key case is Kennedy, Kennedy, and Thwaite, Thwaite. And they're the individuals, normally the employment disputes are all resolved internally. They would have been resolved by a tribunal of NATO. But the individuals complained for various reasons that the level of legal protection and the level of respect being accorded their rights within the institution were not sufficient relative to what the European Convention on Human Rights demanded. And therefore, the cases found their way into a domestic court. Another instance where you might find that would be if you had a third-party complainant. Now, if you've got a third party that is affected by a project that the institution is financing, then there are processes enabling that institution to bring a complaint. Or if a supplier of goods or services misses out on being selected by the institution, and they allege, say, that there was some form of misprocurement, that they really should have been selected themselves, but the winning party should be disqualified because there was some improper payment made or was affected by fraud or a similar complaint, then there are processes for bringing those within systems put in place by the institutions. But sometimes those individuals can go off to domestic courts, and there the institutions will usually fight quite hard to make sure that the domestic courts do not have jurisdiction and the matter has to come back to be dealt with by the systems that have been put in place by the institution. But that only works where there are systems in place by the institution and where they are credible. But there are cases to that effect, and there's actually a Supreme Court decision of Canada that deals with a procurement case where ultimately it was decided that the Canadian domestic courts did not have jurisdiction and that matters had to be dealt with by, in that case, the World Bank's relative bodies. So I will stop there. Thank you, everybody, for your attention.